German Shepherd refuses to leave the side of a frail white kitten, her eyes locked on the glass of its enclosure like she's guarding a secret too heavy for words. She doesn't eat, she doesn't sleep, she just waits. At first, Dr. Brooks thinks it's instinct, some leftover training, maybe even empathy. But then he sees what she keeps staring at. A mark. A clue, and in that moment, everything he thought he understood unravels. This isn't just loyalty. It's a thread pulled loose from a story no one knew existed. A missing child, a desperate journey, and a second chance clawed out of the dark. But how did it begin? And why does this kitten matter so much? Tell us where you're watching from and let's begin. The storm had rolled in silently overnight, soaking the sidewalks of Fairhill with its stubborn drizzle. The kind that didn't pour but lingered clinging to the glass windows of the Southside Veterinary Clinic like a memory unwilling to be forgotten. Inside, the warmth was soft and yellow, the light humming quietly above the tiled floor where Dr. Elijah Brooks stood, holding his second cup of coffee of the morning. The smell of wet dog, antiseptic, and a faint trace of lavender from the cleaning solution formed the familiar scent of home for him. He was a tall man, shoulders slightly hunched from years leaning over exam tables, skin the hue of polished mahogany and eyes constantly carrying a softness, as though still searching for something he couldn't name. Nova, his German Shepherd, sat by the far end of the treatment room, not on her usual orthopedic pad near the reception area, but pressed against the glass enclosure where the white kitten lay, curled into herself like a comma at the end of a forgotten sentence. "Still there, huh?" Elijah murmured, walking over slowly, his footsteps echoing lightly against the linoleum. Nova didn't turn, her amber eyes locked on the kitten, her breathing steady, but her body taut, poised not in fear or aggression, but as though shielding something fragile from the weight of the world. The kitten hadn't moved much since she was brought in last night. A postal worker, Carrie, was it, had found her in the rain, trembling behind the dumpster near the old Valero gas station. She hadn't eaten, hadn't hissed, just let herself be picked up like she was done trying. Elijah had seen a lot of rescues in his 15 years, but there was something about this one that crawled under his skin. The bruises on her flanks were light but undeniable, and there had been no defensive behavior, not even a twitch when he'd lifted her. Nova hadn't left the enclosure all night. Elijah had watched from the monitor on his tablet, expecting her to return to her bed eventually. She didn't. Not for food, not for comfort. This morning her bowl remained untouched. "What is it about her?" he asked, crouching next to the enclosure. The kitten opened her eyes slightly startling blue against the pale white of her fur, and then closed them again, as if seeing was simply too much effort. Elijah grabbed a sterile cotton swab from the tray beside him, gloved up, and gently opened the door of the enclosure. Nova rose immediately, watching his every move. "Relax, girl," he whispered. "I'm just checking." He lifted the kitten gently. She was lighter than he expected, bone and fur. He laid her on the exam table and turned on the lamp overhead. As the light struck her side, something caught his eye. Just beneath the fur, along her back legs, a faint reddish-brown stain. Dried. Subtle. He moistened a cloth and dabbed gently. The color deepened. Not urine, not dirt. Blood. Nova whined softly. Elijah looked up. Her ears were forward, her tail stiff. Not fear, not concern. Expectation. Elijah turned back to the kitten. He took a new cotton swab and rolled it against the patch. Then another. Enough. "That's not your blood, is it?" he said aloud. The kitten didn't respond, but Nova let out a low chuff and lay down again, her eyes not leaving the table. Elijah walked to the counter, placing the samples into the small in-house analyzer. As the machine whirred, he rubbed the back of his neck. Something was off. He opened his tablet and scrolled through local news headlines. He paused at the third story. 7-year-old Benji Miller still missing. He tapped the article. A photo popped up. The boy smiled at the camera, arms wrapped tightly around a ginger cat that probably belonged to someone else. Last seen near Oak Avenue Elementary, wearing an orange hoodie, blue jeans. Elijah read aloud, "Blood type O positive." The analyzer pinged. Elijah stepped closer, heart thudding faster than it should. The results appeared in soft digital blue. Human. Blood type O positive. He stood still for several seconds, clenched, clutched. It wasn't proof of anything yet coincidence. But Nova didn't believe in coincidences. Neither did Elijah, not since the day his nephew vanished 5 years ago. Another boy, another stormy night, another town that moved on too quickly. He turned to look at Nova. "You're not letting this go, huh?" he asked quietly. The dog blinked once. No bark, no tail wag, just quiet confirmation. Elijah walked back to the kitten, rewrapped her gently, and placed her back inside the enclosure. Nova immediately repositioned herself in front, lowering her body like a soldier standing guard. Elijah looked at the clock. It was only 9:07 a.m., but the air felt heavier, like something had just cracked open, something hidden beneath the surface. He picked up his phone, not the clinic line, his personal one, dialed the number of someone he hadn't called in years. It rang 3 times before the voice answered. "Marcus Chen," said the voice. "Detective," Elijah said slowly. "I think I have something you need to see." The rain hadn't stopped. It hissed against the windows like static, a low white noise that coated the outside world in gray. Inside the clinic, the silence felt almost holy, too still, too aware. Elijah Brooks sat at his desk reading over the blood test printout again, as if the results would suddenly say something different the 5th time around. Human. All positive. Not a match to the kitten, that much was clear. And yet Toast hadn't left Nova's mind or her side since she arrived. Nova hadn't touched her breakfast, hadn't wagged her tail, hadn't even returned to her usual spot by the front counter. She stood, stiff and alert, a sentinel before the kitten's enclosure, her breathing shallow but steady, her eyes trained on Toast like a protector guarding a crown jewel. Elijah had tried coaxing her with her favorite treat, those dried liver strips she usually went nuts for. Nothing. Just a faint flick of her ears, then silence. She hadn't slept either. The clinic's overnight camera confirmed it. Nova had sat there from 10 p.m. to dawn, occasionally lying down but always watching, always listening, never looking away from Toast, who barely moved except a twitch in her sleep. That kind of behavior might have seemed sweet to someone who didn't know Nova, but Elijah did. Nova didn't do attachment. Not like this. She was professional, precise. She cared, yes, she had a gentle side, but she never fixated. Not like this. This was something else. Elijah scrolled through his tablet again, pulling up the video feed from earlier that morning. The moment he had stepped out for a coffee break, the news had flicked on, just background chatter filling the room. But Nova's reaction hadn't been background. She had been lying near the front, almost dozing, when the TV cut to the segment about the missing boy. The moment the name Benji Miller was spoken, she had snapped to attention, her ears pricked, her body rigid. Then the photograph flashed on screen, a close-up of the boy's smiling face, bright and carefree, with that orange hoodie everyone had memorized by now. That was when Nova stood up, tail straight, chest puffed out, and then something she'd never done before in this setting, she barked. One loud, sharp, defiant bark. Elijah had come back just in time to see her frozen, watching the screen like she understood every word. The bark wasn't random. It was deliberate, a declaration, a warning, a signal. He rewound the footage now, watching her posture frame by frame, the tightening of her stance, the way her breathing shifted, the sharp twitch of her muzzle just before she barked. Elijah leaned back, heart drumming. He looked over at Nova now, still camped out in front of Toast's enclosure, eyes heavy with fatigue but unwavering. "You saw something, didn't you?" he whispered. "Or you know something I don't." Nova didn't respond, but Toast did, barely. The kitten opened her eyes, blinked once at Nova, then curled tighter, her tiny pink nose buried beneath her tail. Elijah walked into the break room and poured himself more coffee. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the mug. The memory of his nephew, the one who vanished years ago, had returned with the weight of a wave. The same stillness, the same sudden void. But unlike then, he had something now. Not evidence exactly, but instinct. And Nova's instincts had never been wrong. She hadn't passed her police canine trial, not because she refused to detach emotionally. She failed her final test by refusing to leave a child she'd found during a mock search and rescue drill. She lay beside the boy and wouldn't move, even as her handler shouted commands. That was 5 years ago. The same year Elijah's nephew went missing. He hadn't connected those timelines before, not until now. He returned to the treatment room and crouched beside Nova. "Talk to me, girl," he said softly. "What do you smell? What do you see?" Nova tilted her head slightly, eyes locked on Toast, then flicked toward the window. Elijah followed her gaze, seeing nothing but rain-smeared glass. He turned back to the kitten, who had not moved since morning. The strange thing was Toast didn't seem afraid of Nova. In fact, whenever Nova approached, the kitten's body relaxed just a little. Like the sound of Nova's breathing was familiar or comforting. Elijah stepped into the lab room, pulled out a hair sample from Toast and ran it against his micro-residue scanner. He wasn't expecting results, not really, but when the machine beeped softly, he turned his head. Aluminum oxide, soot particles, trace mold ventilation signature, HVAC ductwork grime. Exactly the kind you'd find in an old, unused building, like the back of the Valero station, the one where Toast was supposedly found. Elijah swore under his breath. He picked up the phone again and dialed Marcus. No answer. He left a message. "Detective Chen, it's Brooks. I've got something. No, I've got a lot. That kitchen, she wasn't just left behind, she came from somewhere, and she's carrying evidence. We need to talk." He hung up, eyes flicking back toward the enclosure. Nova was now sitting upright. Toast had shifted in her sleep, one paw extended against the glass like she was reaching out. Nova leaned forward until her nose brushed the same spot from the other side. The quiet in the room wasn't peaceful. It was charged, like something had been held at bay too long and was about to crack. Elijah walked slowly to the enclosure and lifted the lid. Nova stiffened. Toast didn't move. Carefully, he reached in and lifted the kitten again. She whimpered softly, but didn't resist. He placed her on the table and examined the bruises again. Faint, evenly spaced along the side of her belly and flank. Not bite marks, not a fall. Elijah frowned, adjusted the light and saw them for what they were, finger-sized impressions. Human grip, small but firm, like a child had been holding her. Not hurting her, but holding too tight, desperate tight. He glanced at the TV again. The segment on Benji was looping, the photo of the boy grinning in that bright hoodie filling the screen. Nova barked again, twice, not at the kitten, at the screen. Elijah froze, the pieces starting to arrange themselves. Benji, the kitten, the HVAC residue, Nova's reaction, the blood type. Something wasn't right, and Toast. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk in the dimly lit treatment room, the rain still whispering against the windows, as Nova stood like a statue beside Toast's enclosure, her body unmoving except for the occasional shift of her ears. The kitten had finally started breathing deeper, her chest rising and falling more rhythmically under the warm red glow of the heating lamp. But Elijah's mind refused to settle. The bark Nova gave when Benji's image flickered on the screen wasn't a reflex. It wasn't triggered by a sound or sudden movement. It was deliberate, targeted. That photograph, the boy in the orange hoodie, had struck something inside the dog that even her years of training couldn't suppress. Elijah pulled up the missing poster again on his tablet, zooming in on the hoodie. The fabric was bright orange fleece with a synthetic weave, the kind that fuzzed and frayed easily at the sleeves and hem. He stared at the texture, committing it to memory. Then he looked over at Toast. She had begun grooming herself, slow licks tracing her forepaw, and with each movement, Elijah noticed something strange in her fur, near her hind leg. Not dirt, not blood. He leaned closer and saw it. A thread. Not white like her coat, not the grayish color of insulation dust. Orange, bright and unmistakable. His heart knocked hard against his ribs as he carefully opened the enclosure door. Nova tensed beside him but didn't move. Toast paused mid-grooming as Elijah gently lifted her onto a fresh examination towel, placing her under the light. He parted her fur, tweezers in hand, and delicately pulled free the thread. It was short, barely 2 inches long, but its color and fuzzy texture were undeniable. Elijah placed it on a sterile slide and held it under the scope. The synthetic fibers reflected the light in a pattern that matched perfectly with the hoodie in Benji's photo. He sat back slowly, mouth dry. This wasn't just proximity. This was physical contact. Direct contact. The kitten hadn't just been near Benji. She had been with him, held against him, clung to, maybe even hidden by him. Elijah took out the dish towel that Toast had been wrapped in when the postal worker Carrie brought her in. He hadn't paid much attention to it at first. It was old, faded blue, with a checkered pattern and frayed corners, like something grabbed in a rush. But as he unfolded it and laid it flat on the counter, something oily stained the underside. He ran a gloved finger across it, lifted it to the light black, slick. The smell was chemical burnt plastic and rust. He'd smelled it before. HVAC grease, industrial duct tar. He looked closer and found another smear, this one gritty to the touch heap, and placed it under the light. Insulation powder, the fine pink-flecked kind that clung to clothing and skin. He ran it against the residue scanner, and the display confirmed his suspicion. Fiberglass particles mixed with aluminum traces and oxidized debris from aged ventilation lining. The towel wasn't random. It was from inside a duct. Someone had either pulled it out from an old vent or used it to wrap the kitten after she crawled or was pushed through one. He checked the corners of the towel and saw that the edge stitching had been torn, not cut, like it had been ripped in haste. And then he looked at the kitten again. Toast had begun purring faintly, curled on the towel like it was the only thing in the world she trusted. Nova sat a foot away, eyes following every twitch of Toast's ears. There was something more going on here. Elijah could feel it, vibrating just beneath the surface of his skin. He turned toward his filing cabinet and pulled out the crime scene photos he'd printed earlier, the ones from the initial search around Valero. Most of them showed empty terrain, the side of the gas station, overgrown bushes, broken signage. But one stood out now. He hadn't noticed it before. In the corner of one image, near the rusted HVAC unit bolted to the exterior wall, there was a dark strip of what looked like insulation trailing toward the ground. He zoomed in. It matched the composition of the residue on the towel exactly. Elijah's pulse quickened. He opened his notes and began cross-referencing. Carrie had claimed to find the kitten by the dumpster behind Valero, but now that phrase felt wrong. The towel, the thread, the soot, the insulation. Toast hadn't been wandering in the open. She had come out of somewhere, confined space, a vent, a tunnel. And wherever she had been, Benji had been there too. He lifted the kitten again, this time more carefully, and began brushing through her coat with a fine-toothed grooming comb. It caught a few more particles, dark specks of ash, a shard of plastic, a single black hair not hers. He bagged each piece, labeled everything. Nova stood now, moving to sniff the table's edge where Toast lay. Elijah watched her closely. She lowered her snout, then looked up at him with eyes full of weight. "You're telling me we missed something," Elijah said softly. "We all missed something." The image of the orange hoodie returned again and again in his head. The boy holding something close, hiding it under his jacket. Toast, and then what? Caught, pulled apart, Benji vanishing, the kitten escaping, and Nova reacted like it was all happening again. Elijah wrapped the thread carefully in a specimen slide, taping it closed. He placed it alongside the towel and the test results. Then he turned and looked back at the enclosure. Toast had returned to her usual corner, but now her head was raised. She watched him, eyes wide, ears alert. He glanced at Nova. She had taken her spot back in front of the glass body rigid. Something was still missing, and they both knew it. The sky had turned the color of pewter by the time Elijah pulled his truck into the cracked lot of the Valero station. The building looked even more desolate than he remembered. The faded logo above the entrance had peeled almost entirely off the glass, the gas pumps long removed, and weeds coiled like veins through every fissure in the concrete. Elijah killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment, one hand resting on Nova's thick scruff. She was already up in the passenger seat, her body tight with alertness, ears forward, pupils narrowed. She'd known where they were going. The tension in her frame had changed the moment they turned off the main road. "Let's take a look," he said, reaching for her leash. But before he could clip it on, Nova leapt out the open passenger side door and landed hard, nose already to the ground. She didn't wait, she moved with purpose, swift, silent, and surgical. Elijah followed quickly, pocketing his flashlight and a small evidence kit. He stepped over a shattered piece of siding and approached the side of the building, where he remembered Carrie had vaguely pointed when she'd dropped off Toast. The dumpsters were still there, overflowing, half canast, and surrounded by old takeout bags and rusted metal. Nothing recent, nothing useful, but Nova had no interest in the dumpster. She was already halfway down the far wall, her body moving low to the ground, tail stiff and angled. Elijah jogged to catch up, boots scraping against gravel. "What is it, girl?" he whispered, scanning the wall ahead. That's when he saw her freeze. Nova's paws planted firmly at a patch of moss-covered bricks near the corner where the outer HVAC unit was bolted in place. She stood still as stone, except for the subtle ripple of a growl rising from deep in her chest. Elijah moved beside her and studied the wall. From a distance, it looked solid aged brick, darkened with grime. But up close, he noticed a faint separation between two of the blocks, a vertical hairline crack that wasn't natural. He crouched and ran his fingers along it. The mortar here was looser, crumbled. Something had shifted this section. Nova pressed her nose to the base of the wall and huffed sharply, then stepped back and let out a low, guttural growl. Not fear, not warning, but insistence. Elijah pulled out a small pry tool from his kit and began working it into the crack. With a gentle push, one of the bricks gave slightly. He leaned closer, shining the retrofit inside darkness. But beyond the edge of the opening, he saw metal, silver with dust caked around the seams. Ventilation paneling. He stepped back and followed the wall with his eyes until they landed on the corroded HVAC unit mounted about 4 feet up. Its grill was hanging by a single rusted screw, the rest twisted or missing. Insulation clumped around the unit like old cobwebs. And there, trailing from beneath it, was a smear of soot. "There you are," Elijah muttered, stepping toward it. Nova moved with him, now silent, focused. She sniffed the metal and let out a sharp exhale, then turned her head and stared directly at him, a single bark escaping her throat. It was different from before. Urgent. Elijah crouched again and examined the gap beneath the HVAC unit. There was a space between the metal and the foundation of the wall, maybe 6 inches high, 8 inches wide. Too small for a person, but just enough for something else. He retrieved a small mirror from his kit and angled it into the opening. The flashlight beam illuminated a narrow shaft beyond the gap, lined with dust, insulation, and what looked like dragged debris, paper scraps. Bits of foil, fur. Elijah's heart beat faster. He knew what this was now. An access route. The Kitten had crawled through here, no been pushed through. Hidden. He reached into the space and pulled out a strip of fabric wedged in the corner. Orange, frayed, soft fleece. His breath caught. Nova let out another bark, sharper this time, and then crouched, belly pressed flat against the ground. She sniffed the air again and let out a whimper. Elijah looked at her, confused. "What is it?" he asked, voice hushed. Nova stood, took 2 steps back, then turned her head sharply toward the vent. She inhaled, froze, then exhaled with a small sound almost like a sigh. Elijah felt it too. In the air, a draft warm and stale, but not empty, not chemical, not metallic. Human. His stomach dropped. He crouched lower and leaned into the vent space, shining the beam deep into the shaft. Dust floated like snow in the air, but as his eyes adjusted, he thought he saw something beyond the turn of the duct. A soft movement, a shimmer of cloth. He held his breath and listened. There it was so faint he almost imagined a sound. A shuffle, a breath, weak, barely there, but real. Someone was inside and they were alive. Elijah's mind was a mess of instincts and half-formed deductions as he backed away from the vent, brushing insulation dust from his sleeves, heart pounding with every beat. Someone was in there, he was sure of it now, alive but fading. He didn't need to wait for confirmation from any department. There wasn't time. He and Nova returned to the truck in silence, the sky beginning to dim into a dull violet as late afternoon settled over the town. Nova sat in the passenger seat, her body vibrating with restless urgency. Eyes locked on the rear view as if watching the station disappear behind them caused her real distress. Elijah reached over and ran his hand down her back, but she didn't react. Her thoughts, whatever they were still inside that wall. Back at the clinic, the air felt warmer than it had before, but not comforting. It was the kind of warmth that pressed against your skin and demanded your attention, like something trying to warn you it was too quiet. Toast was still curled in her enclosure, unmoving, but her ears twitched the moment Elijah walked in. Nova went straight to her, lying down in front of the glass, chest heaving lightly as she let out a low, melodic hum, not quite a whine, not quite a growl. Elijah moved slowly, carefully sliding open the enclosure and lifting the kitten out with both hands. Her body sagged slightly, not limp but tired, like a child waking up from a nightmare too heavy to understand. He placed her on the padded examination mat beneath the warm light and began checking her again, this time slower, more detailed, examining every inch of her pale coat. He was no longer looking for random trauma or surface wounds. Now he was reading her like a page in a story that had just begun to make sense. Around her ribcage, under the left side, he found them faint marks that had been easy to overlook before, small bruises in a half-second, irregular but evenly spaced. They weren't caused by impact or a fall. Elijah had seen enough defensive trauma to recognize when an animal had been struck or shaken. This was something else. He turned her gently and found matching bruises on the opposite flank. No symmetry, no line, just pressure marks. Hands, small ones, the size of a child. He leaned in closer, his breath hitching as he gently brushed the fur aside near her shoulder blade. 3 fine scratches crossed one another like a chaotic starburst. Beneath them, a small puncture. Tooth mark, not deep, not angry, just accidental. Like someone had held her too tightly, like someone had clutched her against their chest during a panic. He swallowed hard and sat back, staring at Toast with renewed gravity. "He held you," he whispered, voice rough. "Not to hurt you, to keep you close." Toast blinked slowly and shifted her weight. Her tiny paw moved in the air for a moment, as if reaching out to something invisible, then dropped gently onto the towel. Nova stood and approached the table. She looked up at Elijah for a beat, then placed her front paws delicately on the edge. He nodded and stepped aside. She leaned in slowly, lowering her snout toward Toast's side, and nudged the kitten softly with her nose. Toast let out a tiny mewl, soft but distinct, the sound raw and tired. Nova responded with a long, careful lick across Toast's ribs. The kitten flinched but then stilled. Her eyes closed, and for the first time since arriving, her breathing didn't sound like fear. Elijah watched as Nova repeated the motion, once, then again, each time pausing after the lick as if waiting for a cue. Each time, Toast let out a small sound. Not pain, something else, a memory surfacing. And then, something peculiar happened. Each time Nova touched the wounds, Toast turned her head not toward the sound or light, but in the same direction every time. She lifted her nose toward the back wall of the treatment room, past the cabinet, past the supply shelf, as if drawn by something beyond. Elijah followed her gaze. There was nothing there, but he stepped forward, placing a pen on the counter and watching where Toast's eyes followed. She ignored the object entirely and returned her gaze to the wall. He crouched beside her, placing his hand gently on her side and whispered, "You want to go back, don't you?" The kitten didn't answer, of course, but Nova did. She chuffed once, low and brief, then sat down directly in front of Toast, her body once again between the kitten and the door. Elijah returned to his microscope and laid out the photos he'd taken of Toast's bruises and cuts. He drew quick sketches beside them, noting distances, pressure angles, bite radius. It all added up. Held tight, maybe even against will, but not in cruelty. Not malicious, defensive. The defensive wounds weren't Toast's. They were Benji's. He'd been trying to protect her just as she had tried to escape, and somehow they both had survived just long enough for their paths to split. Toast finding her way to the light and Benji still waiting in the dark. Elijah set down his notes and looked at Nova, who was now curled protectively around Toast, her body forming a loose crescent. Toast had moved closer, not into the crook of her neck yet, but nearer than before. Trust forming slowly, piece by piece, built not through words but through instinct. The same instinct that had led Nova to bark at a photo, that had pulled Elijah back to that gas station, and now seemed to be guiding them all towards something they hadn't fully seen yet. He flipped back to the missing persons report. Benji's last known location, walking behind Oakwood Elementary, adjacent to the Valero lot. Time 6:42 p.m., reported missing at 7:15. Lajaz stared at the report, then down at the towel Toast had been wrapped in. The scent still lingered. Dust. ash, mold, and something else. Human, weak but present. He looked at Nova, who now had one eye open, watching him like she was waiting for him to catch up. He would. He had to, but first he needed to return to that vent. This time with gear, this time ready. This time. The next morning broke in a strange hush, the kind of morning that feels like the world is holding its breath. Elijah didn't bother changing out of his clinic scrubs. The weight of the last 24 hours sat heavy on his shoulders as he poured black coffee into a paper cup and watched the sky lighten outside his window. Toast was curled once again in her heated enclosure, finally sleeping in a position that didn't look like fear. Nova sat beside her, unmoving, eyes half closed but alert beneath the surface. Elijah checked his phone, saw no new calls from Marcus, and tapped instead into the clinic's appointment system. One walk-in is scheduled. No name, just a time, 8:00 a.m. That wasn't unusual for Saturday mornings. What was unusual was the feeling he got in his chest the moment the front bell jingled and she walked in. Carrie Jenkins stood in the doorway like she had the first-time post office jacket slung over her shoulder, hair pulled back tight under her cap. But today something about her eyes looked sunken, not tired, haunted. She clutched the same mailbag, only now it looked almost too big for her thin frame. "Dr. Brooks," she said, voice weaker than he remembered. "I didn't have an appointment, Elijah waved her in silently and gestured toward the bench near the reception desk. Nova lifted her head the moment Carrie stepped inside, eyes sharpening, shoulders rising an inch. Elijah noticed it. So did Carrie. "Taken to ask about the kitten," she offered quickly as though rehearsed. "I know you said I could check in. I just wanted to see if she's stable," Elijah interrupted gently but firmly. "Sleeping now, she's been through a lot." Carrie nodded. Her fingers twisted the strap of her bag again and again. Her mouth opened, then closed. Finally, she said, "I wasn't honest. That night, I need to say something now." Elijah said nothing. He just waited. Behind the counter, Nova rose slowly and stepped forward. Her eyes fixed on Carrie in a way that made the woman shift uncomfortably in her seat. "I didn't find the kitten by the dumpsters," Carrie admitted, her voice almost inaudible. I said I did, and I thought maybe I could leave it at that, but that's not where I saw her first. She was by the wall, near the back wall near the broken HVAC unit." Elijah nodded slowly, his chest tightening. "I was doing my last pickup at the drop box behind the corner store," Carrie continued. "That path cuts behind the gas station. I was on foot, because the mail van broke down that afternoon, so I was late, maybe 15 minutes behind." Did you see Carrie?" Elijah's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Not anger, urgency. Carrie's eyes welled, but she blinked them dry. "I saw a man," she whispered. "He had a child with him. A boy, small. Looked like he didn't want to go. He wasn't crying loud or anything, but he looked stiff. Like frozen. The man was pulling him back." Elijah's knuckles went white as he gripped the counter. Nova was now fully upright, tail down, hackles raised, ears forward like a statue about to strike. Carrie didn't notice, her words now tumbling out like a dam breaking. "Told myself maybe it was just a parent disciplining a kid. Maybe a tantrum. I didn't want to assume the worst. People get in trouble for that now, for saying something wrong. So I left. I didn't call it in. I didn't tell anyone. And then when I found the kitten the next day, all dirty and shaking, I thought maybe it had gotten out of wherever they went. But I panicked. I figured if I brought it to you, maybe you'd connect, but I didn't want to be the one who said something out loud." Elijah's throat tightened. "What time was this, exactly?" Carrie hesitated, then answered, "It must have been around 6:45. Maybe a minute after." There was a sharp bark. "Nova." The sound cut through the clinic like a blade. Not warning, not alert. Rage. Carrie jumped, her eyes darting toward the shepherd who now stood fully in front of her, blocking the space between the door and the rest of the clinic. Her growl was low and building, eyes locked on Carrie with something Elijah hadn't seen in years: true aggression. "Nova," Lisha had said quickly, stepping in, back. But Nova didn't move. Her eyes were full of something else now. Not just instinct, not just protection. Memory, pain. Something deep and ancient burned there, and Elijah's blood ran cold. Because he remembered. 6:45 p.m. That was the time his nephew Jamal had vanished. 5 years ago, different place, different day, but the time. Elijah put a firm hand on Nova's collar. She resisted, then slowly, deliberately stepped back, her breath ragged. Toast stirred in the enclosure behind them, mewing softly. Carrie had gone pale, her hands trembling. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know it mattered that much." "It always matters," Elijah said, his voice lower now. "You said nothing for days. That's time we won't get back." Carrie looked down, shame etched in every wrinkle. "But now you've said it," Elijah added, "and we'll act on it." He opened the drawer behind the counter and pulled out a form. "Write it down. Every word. Everything you saw. The time, the direction they went, the look on the boy's face." Carrie nodded and took the pen. Nova remained near, eyes still trained on Carrie's every move. Elijah stepped into his office and closed the door behind him, his hands shaking. The clock on the wall ticked 9:17. Exactly 5 years ago to the minute, he had stared at a police dispatcher, begging her to take his report seriously. Nova had been by his side then too, smaller, greener, already tuned to grief like an antenna to static. He stared at the wall for a long moment, then at the folded photo of Jamal he kept inside his desk drawer. The boy in that picture was the same age Benji was now. Same bright eyes, same trusting smile. Outside the office, Nova let out a single quiet bark. It was time to return to the place where the timeline had broken. The town slept heavy under a low blanket of fog as Elijah killed the engine near the edge of the abandoned Valero lot, the headlights cutting briefly through the mist before he turned them off completely. The clock on his dash read 4:47 a.m., just a few minutes before dawn, the time when the world still feels hollow and the air tastes like secrets. Nova sat in the passenger seat, tense and focused, her breath fogging the window in quiet puffs as she stared toward the rust-stained silhouette of the gas station. Elijah reached for the flashlight, double-checked the batteries in his headlamp, and zipped up the front of his canvas jacket. "You ready?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. Nova didn't look at him. She was already pushing her weight against the passenger door, ready to move. He clipped her leash and stepped out into the dew-soaked gravel, boots crunching softly as they approached the side wall. The shadows were still deep in this hour, but Elijah knew the way now. They followed the back edge where the cinderblock wall met the foundation, down to the warped metal grill that had once been part of a functioning HVAC system and now sagged on one rusted hinge like a broken jaw. Nova sniffed along the bottom edge, then pressed her body low to the ground and released a sharp huff of air. Then another, each one sharper, more urgent. Elijah crouched beside her, listening. At first it was nothing, just the wind catching in the loose vents, maybe the scrape of a branch against the far side of the building. But then it came again, a sound that didn't belong, a whisper of breath, a noise too soft to be mechanical, a whimper. Nova's ears shot up and she looked directly at Elijah, tail stiff, then barked once short, clipped, the kind of bark she only gave when she'd found something alive. Elijah's pulse spiked. He grabbed the power drill from his backpack and went to work on the last 2 screws. They were rusted to hell but broke loose with a painful shriek that echoed off the concrete. Nova didn't flinch. She stood guard, eyes locked on the dark cavity beyond the grate. When it gave way, Elijah pulled it aside and shined his light into the opening. The crawl space was narrow and grimy, barely enough room for someone to slide in. But it stretched deeper than he thought, curving slightly after a few feet and disappearing behind a web of insulation and sagging ductwork. The smell hit him next. Damp fiberglass, old mold, sweat, and something else, faint but unmistakable blood. He looked at Nova. She stared back, her body quivering with restraint. "Guard." Nova stepped aside, reluctantly, and watched with fierce eyes as Elijah dropped to the ground and slid into the vent. The metal scraped at his elbows and the air grew tighter with every foot he advanced. The walls breathed heat and silence. He passed clusters of torn insulation, flecks of soot, and a tiny set of paw prints pressed into the dust toast. The duct turned sharply after 6 feet, and he had to shift his weight to angle through. That's when he saw it. A small mound curled in the shadows, almost invisible. His light flicked over it and froze. A child. limbs drawn tight, head bowed, breathing shallow. Elijah's chest locked. "Benji," he called softly, not wanting to startle the boy if he was conscious. The shape flinched. A dry gasp escaped the bundle. "Benji, it's okay, I'm here to help, I'm Dr. Brooks." The boy shifted, painfully slow, revealing a face streaked with grime, cheeks sunken, lips dry and cracked, but his eyes opened at the sound of the name. The boy's hands were clenched around something tight, a strip of orange fleece torn, frayed, and dirty, and clutched beneath it, faint red scratches. The kind Toast might have made in panic or in fear, and yet the way Benji held it like it was a lifeline spoke volumes. Elijah's voice caught as he whispered, "We found her. Toast, she's safe. She led us to you." Benji blinked, eyes swimming in and out of focus, and his lips moved again. This time the words were a whisper so soft Elijah had to lean in close to hear. "Don't take Toast away." Elijah closed his eyes briefly, his hand trembling as he reached for the radio. He clicked it once, pressed the button, and spoke low but clear. "This is Dr. Brooks at Valero Station. I've located the missing child. Repeat, I have visual on Benji Miller, alive. Requesting immediate emergency response." He clicked off and crawled forward another few inches. "It's okay, Benji," he said. "Help is coming, just stay with me." But Benji didn't respond this time. His body sagged again. Elijah reached for his wrist cuffs, heart thudding, and felt it weak, thready. But there, he needed to get the boy out, fast. Elijah was reaching into his pack for the collapsible blanket and glucose gel when he heard the low scrape of claws on metal behind him, followed by a sharp breath of air and a sudden shift in weight through the tight duct. He turned his head just as Nova forced her way into the crawlspace without hesitation, her powerful frame slinking low to the surface, fur brushing insulation as she squeezed through. "Nova," he hissed, panicked for a moment, unsure how she'd even managed to fit. But the dog didn't stop. She moved with fierce intent, crawling toward the boy with her tail low, body trembling with control. And when she reached Benji, she didn't bark, bitty whine, pressed her nose gently to his cheek and began to lick. One stroke, then another, long, deliberate, and full of purpose. Elijah froze, breath catching, and watched as Benji stirred beneath her touch, his cracked lips parting with a quiver. A sound escaped him, not a word yet, just a breath with the weight of 1,000 buried cries. Nova licked again, her tongue dragging across his chin, his forehead, and then he gasped sharply and his eyes flew open in shock and confusion. For a split second, Elijah saw only fear in those eyes, wild and feral. But then recognition crashed through as Benji reached out blindly with a broken sob. "Nova," he whispered, then louder, as if dragging himself back to the surface of reality. "Nova." His hands clawed toward her fur, fingers gripping shakily into the coarse black and tan, as he began to cry in deep, aching waves. Nova didn't flinch. She pressed herself to him, curling slightly around his torso like she had with Toast, her body forming a living shield as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." Elijah reached forward, pulled the thermal blanket from his pack, and gently wrapped it around both of them, Benji's frame nearly disappearing beneath the folds. The boy's fingers clung to Nova, like he'd been holding on to that moment in dreams. "You came back," Benji murmured, eyes fluttering. "I didn't think anybody would." Elijah leaned close and said softly, "We never stopped looking, kid." Toast didn't either. At the sound of the kitten's name, Benji turned his face slightly, the tiniest hint of a smile cracking through the dirt and salt on his skin. "She got out?" "Yeah," Elijah nodded, swallowing hard. "She led us here. She's safe. And you're going to be too." But even as he said it, something flickered in his mind, a memory Nova had never been trained to share. Something instinctual, something primal. The way she'd sniffed around the vent days earlier. The way she had lingered near the clinic's south-facing wall, pacing in slow circles, always watching the direction of the old road. Elijah remembered the first night Toast had arrived, how she'd refused food until Nova pressed against the glass, how the kitten had stared out again and again toward the direction of Valero, how she'd chosen the exact moment to try and escape the enclosure 3 nights ago, just before Elijah returned from refueling the generator. He had thought it was chance, a stray reflex, but now the puzzle pieces began to turn. He looked at Nova, then at Benji's small hand still gripping the strip of torn fleece. Was Toast with you in there? He asked. Benji nodded weakly. She wouldn't leave. I told her to go. She scratched me, but she stayed. How did she get out? Elijah pressed. You pushed her. Benji shook his head slowly, eyes glassy again. Nova, he mumbled. Nova pushed her. Benji's lips trembled. She picked him up, nudged her toward the air. There was food. I smelled it. Toast did too. Nova spelled it first. She showed her the way. Toast squeezed through the vent. She looked back at me. I said go. Elijah sat back, stunned. The vents, the scent, 2 kilometers between Valero and the clinic, barely possible for a weak, half-starved kitten, but if Nova had picked up the scent of kibble or antiseptic from the treatment room, Toast could have followed it like a lifeline. She had clawed through grime, crossed fields, dodged cars, all because Nova sent her, all because something inside the dog knew that help waited down that path. Elijah looked at the boy again, then back at Nova, who was now resting her head gently on Benji's chest. Breath synced with the rise and fall of the child's. The radio crackled suddenly. This is Unit 4, ETA 2 minutes. We've got eyes on your location. Elijah reached up and clicked the mic. Copy that. Prepare for extraction. Child is conscious but weak. Bring trauma blanket, glucose, and IV line. He turned back to Benji, who was blinking slowly now, body relaxing into Nova's warmth. The flashlight's glow shimmered on the duct walls, revealing fragments of insulation stuck to the boy's skin. The scratches from Toast now crusted in dried blood and dust. Still, Benji didn't pull away. He buried his face into Nova's fur and whispered one last thing, something Elijah barely caught. She didn't give up on me, and neither did Nova. The hallway outside the emergency trauma room was awash in low blue light and the rhythmic pulse of machines echoing behind closed doors. Elijah sat slumped in a plastic chair, streaked with dust, blood, and insulation fibers, his hands raw from crawling through metal. Nova lay stretched out beside him, unmoving, her chest rising and falling in steady cadence as though her own heart had finally given itself permission to rest. The doors swung open with the soft hiss of pneumatic hinges, and a nurse in green scrubs stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning until they landed on him. Dr. Brooks? She asked. Elijah rose immediately, voice caught in his throat. He's stable, the nurse continued, a relieved smile cracking through her fatigue. Mild hypothermia, dehydration, a few superficial scratches and bruises, but no fractures, no internal damage. He was lucky. Elijah exhaled so hard his chest caved forward, and his hands briefly gripped his knees as he leaned into the gravity of the moment. Can I see him? He asked. Just a minute. The nurse nodded. He's waking up. Inside the room, Benji lay beneath crisp white sheets, his head turned toward the window where morning had just begun to stretch long fingers of golden light across the floor. His lashes fluttered, then lifted slowly, revealing eyes rimmed with red but shimmering with life. The first words out of his mouth were barely more than a whisper. Toast? Where's Toast? The nurse turned toward Elijah. He's asking for the kitten. Elijah smiled softly, stepping closer, pulling his phone from his pocket. She's safe, he said gently. Back at the clinic, Nova's with her. He pulled up a photo he'd taken just hours before, when he and Nova had returned to check on the enclosure. Toast had been curled into her fleece bed, finally relaxed, while Nova stood guard just outside the glass like a silent sentinel. In the image, Nova's muzzle was pressed lightly against the corner of the enclosure, and Toast's tiny paw touched the glass from inside. The boy stared at the photo for a long moment, then gave a smile so faint it looked like it might break apart. But it didn't. She's okay? She's better than okay, Elijah said. She waited for you. Now she's waiting again. Benji nodded and sank back into the pillow, eyes wet but peaceful. Elijah stepped outside to give him space, but even as he stood in the hallway, something cracked open inside him. 5 years ago, this moment had slipped through his fingers. Jamal had vanished one evening, 6:45 p.m., and he had never been found. The hours that followed had gutted him, not because he hadn't tried, but because he'd arrived too late. Nova had searched for days, pressing her nose into every schoolyard and culvert, refusing meals, refusing rest. She'd known something had broken, and Brooks had carried that weight like a wound carved into the bone of his life. But this time, Nova had found the boy. This time, they had been in time. Later that afternoon, when Benji was transferred from ICU to recovery, Elijah returned to the clinic. The waiting room felt brighter, the walls less heavy. Sarah, his assistant, looked up from her desk and immediately smiled. "They called," she said, "from the hospital. He asked for a photo of Toast." Elijah chuckled. "Kid's not gonna let that kitten out of his story anytime soon." Sarah nodded. "And no, he hasn't left the enclosure since," Elijah replied, moving toward the treatment room. Inside, Toast was dozing in the exact same curled pose as in the photo, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Nova lay nearby, her eyes half-lidded, ears twitching slightly at the sound of Elijah's steps. He crouched beside them, resting his hand against the cool glass of the enclosure. For a long moment he said nothing, just breathed. Then he whispered, "You brought him back, both of you." Toast stirred, eyes blinking open, and looked at him without fear now. Her small body shifted closer to the glass as if she understood. Elijah stood, stepped back, and walked into his office. The adoption form was already waiting. He pulled it from the drawer, filled in the name, Toast. Under previous ownership, he wrote, "None, under origin, stray, recovered near Valero." Then he paused, pen hovering, before writing beneath it, "Instrumental in recovery of Benji Miller." The last field asked for reason for adoption. He wrote, "Because no child should lose what they risked everything to protect." That evening, he called the hospital and asked to speak with Benji's father, Joel. The man's voice was gruff, worn thin, but clearer than it had been in their last meeting. "He's talking again," Joel said. "Still quiet, but he smiles when he says her name. That kitten, she saved him." Elijah waited for a beat, then said, "I wanted to let you know I'm adopting Toast, but only on paper. She'll live at the clinic, safe, loved, and Benji can visit her whenever he wants. Any day." There was silence on the other end. Then Joel said, voice cracking slightly, "Thank you, Dr. Brooks, really. Thank you." "No," Elijah replied. "It's me who's grateful. I didn't get a second chance with my nephew, but I did with your son." The line went quiet again, but this time it was filled with something softer, something unspoken, hope, forgiveness, a shared understanding of loss and the time. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the clinic before sunrise. He poured coffee, opened Toast's enclosure, and watched as Nova immediately stepped forward to curl her body around the kitten. For the first time, Toast didn't just tolerate it. She climbed into the warm crescent of Nova's fur and purred, a deep, rolling hum that filled the room with its fragile truth. Elijah leaned back against the wall, watching the pair as the first slant of gold spilled across the floor. Some things, he realized, didn't need to be fixed. They just needed to be held together, long enough to heal. The bell above the clinic's front door gave a soft chime, as it always did, a familiar little sound that had marked hundreds of routine appointments. But today it rang with a peculiar gentleness, as though it too understood that this visit was anything but ordinary. Elijah looked up from his desk just in time to see Benji step through, a little more color in his cheeks than last week, his walk steadier though still careful, and in his hands, clutched close to his chest like treasure, was a folded sheet of construction paper thick with crayon strokes. Joel stood behind him, giving Elijah a nod that held more ease than apology this time, more quiet pride than grief. "You made this," Benji said softly as he reached the desk, his fingers hesitant but his eyes burning, with a kind of urgency only children carry when they're offering something that matters more than words. "For you and Nova. And Toast." Elijah smiled as he took the paper, unfolding it with deliberate care, revealing the drawing beneath, 3 figures beneath a sky of gold and orange. Nova, unmistakably regal, her black and tan fur inked in bold gray lines. Toast, curled in her paws with a smile that somehow radiated from just a simple curve of crayon. And behind them, standing with a stethoscope and the warmest smile Elijah had ever seen drawn in crayon, was a man with salt, his arm raised like he was waving not at them but at the future. Elijah blinked hard, then swallowed the lump rising in his throat as he looked down at Benji. "That's me?" he asked, voice caught in something fragile. Benji nodded. You smiled like that when you told me she waited for me. Elijah reached out and ruffled the boy's curls. It's perfect, he said. Can I hang it here? Benji grinned and pointed to the wall next to Elijah's desk. Right there, so Toast can see it too. Joel gave a quiet laugh and stepped forward, gently placing a small tote bag on the counter. He packed it himself. He said, Toys for Toast. And some dry food just in case, eyeing it, Elijah said, laughing gently as he rose to pin the picture to the wall, straightening it 3 times before stepping back to look at it like a priceless painting. As sunlight spilled through the windows and caught the waxy texture of the crayon, the 3 figures in the picture seemed to shimmer, caught in motion like some part of them had transcended the page. She earned it, Joel replied, looking over his son's head with a gratitude he no longer tried to hide. You all did. That evening, long after the last appointment had ended and the phones had gone quiet, Elijah sat at his desk with the lamp turned low and the clinic bathed in soft amber shadows. The drawing still hung where Benji had asked, its colors warmer now beneath the glow of the desk light. Outside, the wind rustled faintly in the trees, and the moon hung just above the edge of the roof, casting faint silver across the floor like the trail of something ancient and kind. In the treatment room, Toast had long since finished her evening meal, and now lay curled on the fleece bed she had chosen for herself. But not alone. Nova was there, wrapped around the kitten like a sentry and a pillow in one, her chest rising in slow, measured rhythm. Every so often, Toast stirred and nudged closer, pushing her head beneath Nova's chin like a child burrowing into a mother's arms. They didn't need words. They never had. Elijah stood in the doorway for a long time, arms folded across his chest, watching them, the soft sound of their breathing like the final verse of a lullaby. The moonlight caught on the glass of the enclosure and refracted outward, casting a perfect circle of light that fell gently over their resting forms. It wasn't harsh. It didn't blind. It glowed. A halo not of religion but of meaning, of story, of something earned. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, letting the silence hold him. Sometimes in life there are moments so quietly beautiful they hurt not because they're sad, but because they remind us what it means to survive something, to find family in places we never expected, to reclaim light after years of being wrapped in shadow. Elijah had seen loss, had carried it until it became muscle memory. But tonight, he saw something else. A boy who had not died in the dark, a kitten who had crossed miles to save him, a dog who had guarded not just life but faith. And somehow, in the spaces between them all, he had found a piece of himself again. He turned off the light, let the clinic rest, and as he walked past his desk toward the back hallway, he paused once more to glance at the picture. Nova, Toast, and the man behind them with the stethoscope and the quiet smile. The drawing didn't show pain or fear or the nights they had endured. It showed joy. It showed reunion. It showed something else. To hope not as a concept but as a presence. Real, earned, quietly burning. Outside the clinic, the stars had begun to spread wide across the sky, like salt scattered by a hand too full of grace to stop. Inside, Nova shifted slightly in her sleep, curling tighter around Toast. The kitten blinked once, then settled again, her small frame tucked close to the warmth she knew would never leave her. And above them, cast by moonlight and the final flicker of desk lamp low, the halo remained. Not magic, not miracle, just the shape light makes when it passes through something that once was broken and isn't anymore. There are souls born to carry the light for others, even when they themselves have lived in shadow. If this story moved you even just a little, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling the stories that matter. I'm curious, which moment hit you the hardest? Was it when Toast clawed her way to help? Or when Nova woke Benji in that final moment between life and loss? And hey, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below. I read everyone.